From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to Potomac Watch, the podcast of the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of those pages, and today we have a special guest in Doug Schoen, political commentator and Democratic Party pollster. Mr. Schoen was one of the architects of the new Democrat strategy that Bill Clinton used so effectively to win election in 1992 and then recover from the midterm debacle of 1994 to win a second term. He also did polling for Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, to assess if he could run and win as a third-party candidate for president. Doug writes for a variety of publications and as a frequent guest on our Journal editorial report program on Fox News. Welcome, Doug. Good to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
So here we are. We're going to take a look at the presidential race, where it stands now, here about 5 months out from Election Day, 10 days or so since the guilty verdict in New York against Donald Trump. Do you see any trend in the polling so far that notes that this has changed the race?
I think the simple answer, Paul, is that there's been no dramatic change in the race since the conviction. There are some polls, and I'm sure you and many of the listeners have seen, that show maybe 1 or 2 points of movement to Joe Biden in the national polling. But the state-by-state polling, particularly the Fox News polling, is showing a clear lead for the former President Donald Trump, a lead consistent with what the pre-conviction data was showing. And usually as a pollster, you expect something like a criminal conviction to fundamentally alter the numbers. Clearly that hasn't happened. So I would suggest that ultimately, politically at least, the conviction has not really fundamentally changed the race.
Would your analysis of this be that voters had already kind of built into their mental calculations and preferences the fact that this was going on? And a lot of talk on either side. It's either, shows he's a clear evil character, or on the other side that this is a political prosecution. But the voters kind of tuning it out because they know both of these candidates are essentially incumbents of one kind or another, and they know them both well.
I think that's exactly right. And it's certainly what our pre-conviction polling was showing. The Republicans, really 70-80%, saw this as a political case. The Democrats saw it as proof positive that Donald Trump was not fit to be president. And the swing voters basically said they didn't like a conviction, but it wasn't going to really impact their vote. What was most important and remains most important are the issues like the economy, inflation, prices, and the southern border. And those haven't changed. And if those don't change, then the underlying horse race really is unlikely to change too substantially.
So let's talk about the responses from the two campaigns to the conviction, because I think it's interesting to contrast them. Let's start with President Biden's campaign. They seem to be leaning into the, quote, convicted felon, unquote, line as a campaign theme that buttresses their argument that Trump is unfit to be president. They want to make Donald Trump, frankly, the main issue in the race, if they can. Right? Donald Trump's character, his personality, and January 6th, they want to make that an issue. And they seem to think that this conviction will fit into that. What do you think of that as a strategy?
I think everybody is aware of Donald Trump's personal challenges as a leader and as a man. And this case was sufficiently convoluted and involved a bunch of characters testifying that I think, frankly, outside of the borough of Manhattan, are not going to really impact fundamental perceptions. I think the larger point, Paul, is that with Biden with an approval under 40%, knows that unless they make Trump the issue, Biden cannot be reelected on his own. I think that's what's motivating it, but I don't believe it's a winning strategy.
That's interesting. There are an awful lot of Democratic commentators who say this is the sale that Biden has to make if he wants to win. So it's interesting. Now let's take Trump. He has criticized the prosecutor, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, vociferously. He's also attacked the judge, and he's attacked the various prosecutions against him as politically motivated. But it's interesting, on the weekend, he's kind of toned that down a little. He focused on the issues in his Nevada speech, and he's focused more on the issues, whether it be the border in particular, but also the price of goods and services, inflation. He's got the usual attacks on Joe Biden, the worst president in history, corrupt Joe. But if Trump sticks to that, that's smart, because otherwise, if he goes ahead and starts talking about his personal grievances and how he's a martyr and a victim, that just plays into the Democratic strategy of trying to make the election about Trump.
I couldn't agree more, Paul. To the extent that Trump makes the election a referendum on the past, his grievances about the criminal cases, and particularly about the alleged, and I underscore alleged, fraud that occurred in 2020, which most neutral observers, including myself, have largely, if not totally, dismissed. That's a losing strategy for him.
Mm-hmm.
He is ahead, as the Wall Street Journal polling has shown, and most polls, when you ask people who can handle the economy, who can handle inflation, who can handle the Middle East, who can handle politics with Russia and Ukraine, he's ahead on every issue. And what we tell our clients is, if you're ahead on the issues, run on the issues, because people care a lot more about what the impact is on the quality of life than they do about these personal grievances, particularly long since settled issues like the 2020 election.
Yeah, that seems to make the most sense to me, although, as we know from the history of listening to Donald Trump and watching him, he has a hard time restraining himself. And the question is, can he show that discipline for the months ahead? I'd say confidence is not high.
Confidence is not high, but he's got a better team around him this time. And I think he understands what you just said and what I just said. And while he will express his grievances, and it'll be interesting to see on June 27th in the debate how he handles it, but if he is politically wise, which sometimes he is, other times less so, he will focus on these issues and say, this is an election about the issues and about America's future. If he does that, I think it strengthens inexorably his chances of winning. And that would be what I would be telling him, and indeed anyone who asked about how to run the Republican national campaign in 2024.
And that is exactly what they are telling him, Doug, based on my reporting. Question is the candidate listening enough to follow that advice? All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the issues and how they're cutting in this election campaign, including foreign policy, when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot, here with Doug Schoen, a Democratic pollster extraordinaire, talking about the presidential race. You mentioned the issues that are playing to the benefit of Trump, and all the polling shows this economy, inflation, border security, in particular, the price of goods and services. Those have really helped Trump. What is helping Biden? I guess abortion is one. No question that's going to help in some states, particularly states where they're going to have referenda on the ballot about the right to abortion. But one issue that they're trying to use, the Biden campaign has used it from the very beginning and basically almost every day, is that Trump is a threat to democracy. This, of course, plays into January 6th at the Capitol, the riot, and his complaints about the election and reluctance to accept the results of that election. And yet, if you look at the polling, it's a wash. Half the electorate, roughly half, says that Biden's a bigger threat to democracy, and the other half says Trump is a bigger threat to democracy. I guess in part that's just today's polarized partisanship playing out, but that hurts Biden more than Trump, I think.
You know, Paul, again, I'm not advising either campaign, and I've just said what I would tell Trump. But if I was advising Biden, I would say, drop the talk about democracy in the abstract, talk about what you're going to do, given his announcement last week to limit entries at the southern border, double down on that, more executive orders there, but to take a number of issues and arguments to make the case that you understand people's concerns about inflation, about prices at the pump and the gas station, and to say what you're trying to do to proactively and positively now and in the future hold down inflation and hold down prices that people are paying. So far, they have been, in my judgment, myopic or worse in not doing that. And it's redounded to their detriment, almost certainly, given the poll numbers you were citing and the approval numbers that are, as I said, well below 40.
One place where the president has attempted to neutralize a Trump advantage is border security with his new measures on immigration from last week. Still too early to tell the political impact based on any polling. But as you look at the merits, Doug, of the proposal, and on the timing of the proposal here 5 months out, you were with President Clinton when he did some very significant things in 1996 in the run-up to the election to neutralize a gay marriage, for example, at the time, to use welfare reform to neutralize that advantage. And of course, a little earlier in that Congress, go ahead with the balanced budget and driving that issue and neutralizing that. Is this proposal by Biden on immigration and border security going to neutralize that Trump advantage?
I don't think it is. I think it's frankly too little too late. Now, let's be clear that he has to do this and he has to take more proactive steps. It's not enough to just say, oh, there was a bipartisan agreement on the border that the Republicans scuttled. I think he needs to spend the next couple of months underscoring that he had been slow to recognize the seriousness of the problem at the southern border, the impact on cities, the impact on the economy. And I think he needs to do a lot more. We did it, and I appreciate your acknowledging and recognizing what was done in the run-up to the 96 campaign, but we did it much earlier, and we did it much more consistently. I think this is, with the southern border, a first step, and it's probably a good one, but he's very vulnerable to the question of where have you been for the last 3.5 years, and why is the southern border, as some reporting has shown, still as porous as it is? I don't think there are good answers to that. He needs answers if he is to win states where he has a big deficit now, to wit, Nevada and Arizona.
So this needs, in your view, to include a kind of a public recognition, not necessarily a mea maxima culpa, but at least maybe a minor culpa, where he says, look, as you said, you put it well, I think I was slow to recognize this. Now I can see it, and now I'm acting.
Yes, and I'm going to keep acting, and judge me based on what I do, not based on or perceptions of what I should have done. I mean, people are usually rational in assessing people. When you have an approval of 38 or lower, you can't say, oh, everything's really good. Just look at the facts. Look at how inflation's come down. Look at how unemployment's only 4%. You know, it's really better than you think. That usually doesn't work, and I don't think it's going to work here. He has to be a little bit more humble and a little bit more candid with the American people, something, again, that we have seen very little evidence of.
I want to ask about another issue that's obviously been in the news a lot, really for a couple of years, and that is the return of all of this disorder around the world. Of course, the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin on the march, the war in the Middle East, Gaza, and so on, and a general sense that the world isn't very stable and that bad actors are on the march. The conventional wisdom from political scientists, and I think history bears this out, is that foreign policy doesn't tend to be a major issue in American presidential campaigns unless there is a crisis of some kind. What do you think about these issues as an impact in the election? I mean, Trump is trying to make the case that when he was president, there weren't any of these wars, and if he had stayed president, there wouldn't be. Now, that's a counterfactual. It's impossible. The second point, impossible to know. But is that a powerful talking point for Trump or not in this race?
I think, Paul, it neutralizes one of the arguments that the Democrats make, which is that Biden is more committed to democracy, to NATO, to our traditional allies than is Trump, and that somehow the world will be less safe under Trump than it is under Biden, given the conflicts that are going on in the Middle East, the conflict that is going on in Ukraine, the possibility of a conflict with Taiwan, the potential of Iran, and of course, North Korea to be aggressive given their presumed or actual nuclear capability in the case of North Korea. I think all of that serves to undermine Biden's claim and at the very least give Trump a narrow advantage, neutralizing the issue or perhaps giving him something of an advantage. The other point that I think you're alluding to is given the amount of crime and instability that we have in our country now, the protests on college campuses, there is an argument like there was in 1968 and 70 that there is disorder under the Democrats. And I'm wondering if that disorder will manifest itself at the convention in Chicago in the end of August.
Okay, leave aside that domestic disorder point, but typically foreign policy, people don't vote on it. Is that going to be the case this year, or could this be an exception?
Well, if it is an exception, again, the polling is showing, I think by 48 to 42, if I'm remembering correctly, that the electorate prefers Trump to handle Ukraine than Biden, and a similar set of numbers for the Middle East. So I don't think the issue is going to be all that important, but if it is, again, probably will narrowly and modestly benefit Trump. There's no evidence that foreign policy will benefit Joe Biden.
Okay, interesting, because typically that's a strong talking point for a sitting president and incumbent. I've been astride the world and I've done well. So,
well, with two wars raging and the United States being in an equivocal position with both in terms of aid with Ukraine and which side Biden is on in the Middle East and what he's trying to accomplish, it's a tough argument, I think, to make, Paul.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take another break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the risks for both candidates in the presidential debate, the first one coming on June 27th when we come back. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Doug Schoen talking about the presidential race and where it stands. Still some weeks off, but this debate timetable, striking that it's going to be the first one, June 27th, way too early in my mind. But here we are. Neither candidate will have been nominated officially by his party, and yet we're going to have a debate as if they have been. I think there are risks for both candidates here. And Trump, if he looks like he did in that first debate in 2020, raging, self-absorbed, unwilling to listen to the other guy, I think that would hurt him. On the other hand, if Biden looks like he's also angry, befuddled, can't remember names and confuses issues, that may have a bigger peril for him. The upside would be, of course, if he looks in control and in command, then it would tend to mitigate the age issue. How do you see it?
I see the risks exactly as you say. I'm sure the Trump team is saying, stick to the issues. You're going to win on the issues. And you can make the argument that Biden did not tell the truth in the final two debates of 2020 about the laptop, the 51 intelligence officers and the like, that there is instability both at home and abroad under Biden, that range of argumentation focusing principally on the economy and the southern border is likely to have the least risk and the most benefit. For Biden, he's got to make the argument, as you say, that he is both in command and in control, but also has an agenda that is going to benefit the American people who've largely, 2/3 of them or thereabouts, lost trust in his ability to govern.
It's fascinating to me, Doug, watching this race, that neither of these candidates seem to have much of an agenda for the next 4 years. I mean,
Correct.
Trump is harking back to his term, saying it's better than Biden's term. Biden, when asked about the next 4 years, said, well, just more of the same. I'm going to do more of what I've been doing. And neither one has said, okay, I can do this, this, and this. Now, Trump floated, he's going to cut the taxes on tipped income. He floated that in Nevada when he was out there, because, of course, there are an awful lot of workers who get tipped income out there. But that's not a major agenda issue. And neither one has developed much of any agenda.
I think each one sees the risk in developing an agenda, so they are going to stick, at least from what I can tell, I think wrongly, to their talking points. Trump, I think, would do better for himself to outline a plan to stimulate the economy, to hold the line, if not lower the overall rate of taxation to stimulate economic growth. Biden, I think, owes it to himself and to the American people to say, well, more of the same is clearly not what the American people want. How are we going to build on the recent success in bringing down inflation, to create more jobs, to educate people for the jobs that do exist, and to provide a path forward, particularly for younger people who he needs, who have largely given up on the chance of achieving the American dream?
Well, we'll see if one of them can come up with something and drive it home at the debates. Let's finish up by talking a little bit about a couple of the surprises in the polling we've seen, some in the states. I mean, you've probably seen, Doug, the poll that said that Virginia is close within the margin of error in one poll. And then I don't know if that is believable. We probably have to see more evidence of that. Democrats have won Virginia going back many, many years. I think it might be, was it George H.W. Bush who was the last Republican to win Virginia?
I think so.
Yeah. And then Nevada, which Democrats have won in the recent elections since Obama, it seems to be going south for Democrats this year. Those seem to be the biggest changes.
Sure.
Since 2020.
Well, I see Nevada, and having polled out there, the degree of economic dislocation there is as high as we're seeing anywhere. It is a workforce that is largely not college educated, which works to Trump's advantage. And there are a substantial number of Hispanics who, again, are also breaking disproportionately based on prior experience for Trump. So that doesn't surprise me. Virginia really could well be an outlier. I think you're right. We need to see more polling there. But at the very least, what I think we're seeing is that there is very little confidence in Biden. And the other conclusion I've reached looking at the polling is the further south you move away from, say, Wisconsin, Minnesota and Pennsylvania, to Georgia, Arizona, you might include Virginia, maybe you wouldn't, Nevada, the further south you move, the better Trump does. So I take all of these as, yes, it's cautionary for both sides, but there's far more downside for Joe Biden in these numbers than there is for Donald Trump, notwithstanding the national polling, which is virtually tied.
So if the swing states all go the way they did in 2020, except Trump turns Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia his way out of the Biden column, and he keeps all the states he won, including North Carolina, that would take him to 268 electoral votes if Joe Biden wins Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Then it would be 270 to 268. But that means that Biden has to win those three states in the North.
And, again, those are his best options and opportunities. I think the Biden campaign would understand that. But it's going to be a challenge for both. And in those three states, again, Biden's approval is well under 40%. And we've seen in Pennsylvania a couple of polls having Trump either tied or ahead. Wisconsin, Minnesota, we see similar statistical ties. So I'm somewhat pessimistic that Biden will be able to pull it off. Sure, it's possible. I think the Democrats will have a better get out the vote effort. I think the Republicans understood that by only doing election day voting, eschewing early voting and mail-in ballots, they were really hobbling themselves. But the Democrats clearly have a better get out the vote effort and a more robust expenditure level for that, which certainly could be worth a point and a half in those swing states. But candidly, it's going to be a much more challenging situation for Biden than it was 4 years ago, notwithstanding how tight the polls are, given the underlying weaknesses he faces on the issues and in terms of overall job performance.
So to wrap up, if the election were held today, of course it's not, still several months off, but if the election were held today, I would say that Trump is the likely winner. What do you think?
I agree with that. I don't think it would be anything like a landslide. I think we've seen in a lot of polls that there is a greater degree of approval for the Trump presidency versus the Biden presidency. But there are, of course, doubts and serious doubts about former President Trump. But as I look at all the swing state polls and look at the underlying crosstabs among younger voters, Hispanics, African Americans, I see Trump's position improved. And I would say the same thing. Trump has a narrow but clear advantage as we go into the summer and particularly the June 27th debate.
All right, Doug Schoen, thank you. I appreciate your taking the time to do this and the insight.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for listening here to Potomac Watch. We're here every day with this opinion page of the Wall Street Journal podcast. Thanks for listening.